typical fall day. So I think we'll have, we're settling in. You're not missing anything outside. It's just a bunch of gray and rain, which I'm sure there'll be many more months of here. I'd like to welcome all the artists and critics and contributors who are part of the symposium, and welcome to the students and museum visitors. I'd like to thank, it takes a village or a small, large city of Detroit to put on a project like Landlord Colors and its companion Material Detroit. And I'd like to thank some of those pivotal sponsors. It does represent the largest and kind of the most ambitious project in Cranbrook Art Museum's history. I would therefore like to thank the support of the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, who were really tremendous, not only in sponsoring Laura's curatorial research for 3 years to traverse the globe and record some of these stories and histories and to locate works, but also help fund the exhibition itself and the catalog that comes with that. I'd also like to thank the Maxine and Stuart Frankel Foundation and the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, who have been tremendously supportive of Cranbrook Art Museum over the last 5 years as we've engaged the city of Detroit and its artists. And certainly 2 more people to thank. So also thanks to the National Endowment for the Arts for sponsoring this exhibition and supporting it. And all of the donors to the Detroit Initiatives Fund for Cranbrook. That is the project special fundraising initiative that took place last year to help bring Cranbrook to the city of Detroit. So many thanks to all of those sponsors and funders for this, helping us realize this important project. Part of my duty is to help, but I also like to thank my staff for putting all of this on. We're a small but intrepid team of museum professionals trying to put on massive scale projects, and there's about 10 of us, so it's quite a feat. And it's thanks to all of them and to the volunteers and to the many, many interns that we've employed and continue to employ to help us realize all of these ambitious works. So thank you very much to the staff for helping us realize this project. And I'd like to introduce the woman of the hour, I guess. This is kind of the culmination for the show. It opened in June and it closes, I think, next week, right? So we're kind of doing a reverse celebration. We wanted to go more into the ideas and issues that the art raises with the symposium. And the ringleader, I guess, for a lot of what's been happening with the exhibition and with the project in Detroit is Laura Mott, who's Senior Curator of Contemporary Art and Design here at Cranbrook Art Museum. She's been here since 2014, which feels like 20 years ago or something, because she's been very busy doing very, very large-scale works and has done, I think, a tremendous job in being an ambassador for Cranbrook to the city of Detroit and its artists and its artistic community. I know I've learned a lot about the community through Laura and through her work, engaging those artists and those critics as well. So if you please help me welcome to the stage Laura Mott.
Thank you, everyone. This is the culmination of Landlord Colors, a project that's been 4 years in the making that began with a curatorial fellowship with the Warhol Foundation. So I just quickly want to thank Andrew Blauvelt, actually. He's been my dialogue partner on this project for 4 years, and I really appreciate all of the professionalism and guidance he's given me. I also have to make a special mention of Taylor Aldridge, who is going to be with us all day as one of the moderators. Taylor starred with me as a research assistant on this project. The Warhol Foundation announced my fellowship, and within the hour, I got an email saying, I want to work with you on this. Taylor then became a writer for the publication and then a co-curator for Material Detroit. So thank you, Taylor. I'm going to start with a little overview of the project and then kind of walk us through what we're going to be doing today. Landlord Colors, such an interesting title. I actually got the term from a press release by artist Jason Murphy, who's in the exhibition. And the phrase Landlord Colors is a reference to John Baldessari in his own taxonomy of color. And there's artist colors, for instance, and those are the precious colors in tubes at Blick with names. Whereas landlord colors are the economy-sized bucket of paint that you buy because it's cheap. It's whatever is left over in the basement. It's essentially the aesthetics of indifference. And I thought the term poetically spoke to the material conditions surrounding Detroit, which this is the aesthetics of the departed industries and departed residents, and the decisions that were, or the indecisions that had been made for decades. But at the same time, this situation is also has been an enormous resource for artists who choose Detroit and to thrive and love this city. And it's been a kind of a constant process of repurposing, rethinking, renegotiating through objects and through found objects, and telling a sort of a ground-up narration of the city of Detroit. So that's what really founded the idea for Landlord Colors as its conceptual spine. But I wanted to really write and think about Detroit in a more trans-historical art history. So Landlord Colors positions Detroit in relationship to 4 other international art scenes that were generated during times of economic, social, and cultural upheaval. The cultural climate of the Italian avant-garde of the 1960s and 70s and 80s. This is during a time period called the Years of Lead in Italy. And one of the movements that came out in the 1960s was arte povera, which translates to poor art. And this was a using of found and natural material, which I think is a very interesting context in which to think about the own strategies that Detroit has undertaken in a similar time period from the 60s to the present. And then also South Korea from the 1970s, when it was undergoing an authoritarian rule, kind of violent minimalism comes out during that time period. And Cuba from the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s to the present, whereas in a place like Detroit, we have an excessive amount of material. In Cuba, there's a scarcity, so it's a different kind of editorial process, a different kind of provisional art process that comes from that. And then Greece from the last decade, so looking at an economy in real time and the kind of ingenuity and kind of thinking and the kind of sourcing from that economy that's happening with the artists there. So I want to kind of show a few examples. For instance, one of the things that came from this research was artists who were questioning against the realities of lived experience. Progress no matter what's at stake. There's a kind of voracious cycle that we've been in as a humanity to always be in this space of progression when it comes to economy and wealth, and this has led to just an increased amount of collapse and upheaval, and then recovery and collapse and upheaval and recovery. And some of the ways that artists have brought this conversation to the forefront is through material. This is a piece by Pier Paolo Casolari from 1969, and often sometimes just the positioning of 2 materials together. And here we have like a tobacco leaf, and of itself is something that's so, we can trace this material to its own addictive qualities, but also the really complicated economy and history of tobacco throughout the world, and even, for instance, in our own American context. And here it's positioned with neon. This is a 21st century technology. And this kind of commentary on our addiction to this progress. And Allie Mcgee, from the same year, 1969, Allie was directly, in the years after 67, after the rebellion in Detroit, he was walking the city, and he had been making really realistic work of sort of the black body in pain. And he found this piece of canvas, which to him looked like a Ku Klux Klan hood. And he just took it back to his studio, he painted it, he positioned it with this banana, and came up with an ingenious title, Ku Klux Klan. And he talked about abstraction, the found material, and as it being kind of an access back to his own humanity, the use of wit, and sourcing directly from the city. And this influenced his practice moving forward. And at a place like Korea, this is a a different tradition in some ways, in some aspects of what happens in the Western canon, and even their references to philosophy and these kind of age-old questions of man versus nature. Seoul, Korea in the 1970s was under military rule, and this sort of dictatorships, these economic developmental dictatorships continued on. Now Seoul is like unrecognizable from what was in the 1970s. So here we have Park Geun-hye positioning a rock, which is kind of deathless against a television set, which at that moment is considered to be the forefront of technology, but now to us is already an antiquated object. And Diana Fonseca from Cuba. So here she's, really rarely is paint actually its own material history. Usually it's something just applied as a material. But here she's sourcing, directly from the city, from the different architecture that's peeling. And there's layers here. There's layers of history from the Spanish colonialism through the revolution to the present day. So it's a different way of gathering a storytelling. And it also mimics the aesthetic of the city. And then Andreas Lolis, you see some of these pieces upstairs in the gallery. This looks like the kind of discarded material that you would find throughout Athens, but he's actually applying this very classic century trade of marble carving. So this idea of linking back to a material that's part of its art history, but applying it to the current condition of Greece, which is, in addition to suffering from a major economic crisis over the last decade, is also in the forefront of refugee crisis. So using materials as a way to unpack these ideas is an interesting strategy that I took up, and something that we're going to break down today in different panel discussions. By focusing on the materials that artists use to mine meaning, we're able to extract individual narratives of place, regard them as cultural documents of their time, but at the same time also find this universal ability of communication that's happening with the visual art. So we have 4 panel discussions today with some amazing people who've come, some from different countries, from colleagues from different institutions, and then these panel discussions are going to be punctuated by some small breakout presentations that focus on the 4 art scenes that are not Detroit. It's a pretty Detroit-heavy panel, so I wanted to make sure we're able to highlight and extract some, like a deeper understanding of these places. So we're going to, the first panel is going to be titled Material as Material. We're going to be discussing sort of, it's a focus on materiality was interesting to me because actually when in my field of contemporary art, it's often neutralized. Rarely is it on the forefront, and usually we have more of a deference to things like concept, philosophy, politics. But however, within the craft tradition or in the design tradition, materiality is always discussed, and in part this exhibition comes because I've been at Cranbrook for almost 6 years, and this is a conversation we're always having here. So I'm kind of applying it to a more expansive context of contemporary art. I thought it'd be very interesting to have some curators, producers who kind of traverse both worlds, who are coming from the material discussion, material studies, material culture of the craft tradition, but also functioning very vibrantly within the contemporary art context. So we're going to be opening up some of those questions. And then Julia Tolke is going to give a presentation on the politics and poetics of street art and graffiti in Athens, using the work of Panis Papadopoulos as a departure. Then we're going to have a discussion of city as material. This will be moderated by my co-curator, Taylor Aldridge. This is going to be concerning the fabrication of society. Hold on, let me try that one more time. Fabrication of the sociality of cities, its policies, and its humanity. This is going to be a combination of people who are cultural producers, people who are thinking very strategically about the city. We have Cezanne Charles, Abel Gonzalez Fernandez, Julia Tolke, and Michael Stone Richards. And then we're going to take a break, take a 20-minute break where we'll have water and some snacks. And then Vincenzo De Bellis, who is a curator from the Walker, is going to give a presentation on Ioannis Kanellis that will kind of open up a discussion on history as material. Vincenzo will be speaking with myself and also Jose Manuel Macias, an artist from Cuba, and Matthew Langer Harrison, an artist from Detroit, and Scott Hawking, one of the installation artists who's made an epic installation downtown and also a lifelong Detroiter. And then we'll be having a panel called Body as Material, moderated by Taylor Aldridge with Jennifer Harge, who is also an artist we have an installation with at the Artist Market downtown. Billy Mark, who did an incredible performance series at the beginning of this project throughout June and July. Claire Croft, a historian and theorist from the University of Michigan, and artist Kylie Lockwood. I should also mention who's speaking on the material panel alongside myself is artist Zoe Paul from Athens, Anna Walker, who's a curator from the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and is also my co-curator for the upcoming Olga de Amaral retrospective we're working on. Artist Anders Ruwald, who has an installation part of Material Detroit and ongoing. We kind of launched the project, but it continues on to the future. And then Andrew Blauvelt, our director. So I'm actually going to do a quick scene focus on Korea. This is a really incredible amount of work that has been gone into a very specific time period by historians recently, looking at this moment in Korea in the 1970s, in part because it's a version of a minimalism that is not part of the Western canon. And as we ourselves are being asked as art historians and curators to expand beyond that canon, this is something that kind of came up in the forefront. But when I first experienced this work, it was it was so bodily. It was such a visceral experience that I had with this work, and it reminded me so much of my experience when I first came to Detroit and was in Detroit studios. And so I'm going to have a little expansion on that through the work of Ha Chung-hyun. So there was an art movement called Dansakwa that translates to monochrome painting that comes from this time period. And actually, the artist Leo Fon, who's in the show, is usually credited for being the first curator who organized a small collection of this work together. And it's, again, in stark contrast to Western minimalism. And some scholars, including Joan Key, who's one of the leading writers on this art movement, attributes the artistic methods to that of the suppressed freedoms and the limited access of material. Dansakwa, the works bespeak kind of a quiet internal resistance through the use of materials such as found objects. You'll see burlap wrapped canvases, coarse paint, ripped paper. There's a term in Korea called Han, which is used to describe a deeply rooted collective psyche that is accessed to kind of exist at the core of the Korean people, and it's something that kind of defies traditional language. But essentially it's a melody of grief and melancholy, anger, resentment, and it's the result of the emotional result of war, division, oppression for generations, starting with Japanese rule in the early 20th century, the mid 20th century, followed by the Korean War, and then these kind of resulting post-war dictatorships. But the word really starts to emerge as a very significant ideological concept during the 1970s, during a period that is called the Yushun period, which was meant to be restoration. There's like these nice little moments where people use language in very aggressive ways. It sounds positive, but in fact is not at all positive for those who are living through it. This happens in Cuba as well with a special period. And this, so Park Chung-hee's, the regime, this was a time period of severe censorship, the persecution of intellectuals, the persecution of pro-democracy advocates. And so this is kind of what seeds, this is the context that's happening surrounding this work. And one of the things about Ha Chung-hyun is he has a sort of masterful ability to extract conceptual and emotional potency from everyday materials. An example of this is a work that's upstairs in the museum. And here he's using barbed wire as sort of as a form of communication, and it heightens sort of the object-human paradigm, but also it's a material that promises violence. It's meant to ensnare. I remember we just did a walkthrough, and Addie Langford said, like, it's like a death by, thousands of punctures. And that kind of intensity, when you interact with this piece, it translates beyond the Curian context, but is so specific to this time period when, under military rule, this was rampant throughout the city of Seoul. And it's still today, when you go to the border of North and South Korea, it's like an overgrowth that goes for miles. So for Ha Chung-hyun, it was really this. It was this, this was the everyday material of war, and this kind of idea of attention of objects. I mean, this is the kind of language that Liu Fan was also using. This is from 1971. And though he was an expat, he left Korea, he was in Japan most of the time. That's actually where the very first Dansakwa exhibition was organized. This kind of material exploration through this positioning of, again, sometimes just two materials. Here we have industrial rubber and we have rocks. This idea of man versus nature, this kind of polarity. And there's he has this amazing term he calls encounters. When he talks about his work, it's about the encounters of these materials and this kind of philosophical meditation that they ask of us. There's also seeing the work of Kwan Young Woo. And this is, again, something contextualized. Calligraphy, these traditions are such a part of the art history of Korea, of Asia. And so he's using the rice paper that's intended for calligraphy, but instead of using script, he's using his fingernails and he's peeling this away. This kind of anxiety, this kind of pervasive, over and over and over again, kind of testing the limits. And then again, the paper itself becomes the material on the forefront that's being tested. It's not just a surface. And you think about it in a condition when there's such rampant censorship, this idea of that potentiality being taken away, that performance is part of his thinking behind the work. The same for Park Se-bo. He has these circular, almost madness kind of mark making that he's doing through his work. Sometimes he's pushing his paint. Sometimes he's using something like pencil. But again, it's something that's obsessive. He would talk about his work as a form of non-communication, essentially to communicate. That was a privilege that wasn't really part of what they were able to do at that moment. So they kind of changed their language and talked about non-communication as a form of communication. And Yoo Hong-kyun, he's an artist also. This piece is also upstairs. He was an artist who was imprisoned 3 times in his life for his political activism. He was even threatened with execution at one point in the 1950s. And, he has these very thin layers he's building upon, but the canvas itself is this really vulnerable linen, and he leaves it raw. Again, this idea of the potential of communication. This is what the materials are communicating to us. And I'm also gonna end with him with Ha Chung-hyun. He would use as his canvas these found burlap sacks, and these sacks were used for the transportation of agricultural goods. This is at the same time as the Vietnam War. So this burlap sacks, which you'll also see in the Janus Canellis installation upstairs. This material it takes us on a trajectory to what's happening with the economy, what's happening with the politics of its time, and he wraps he uses it and he wraps it as canvas, and he actually performs the painting through the back. I call it performance because he's pushing the paint through the back of the burlap, and it's drying to the surface as a memory of that performance of tension. So this is a great example, I think, launching off point for the potential and the power that materials have, and how the artist's hand is, and how they really enact that upon material. So I'm going to invite my first panel up to these chairs here, and I'm going to give a little overview of their bios in addition to some images. So come on down, Andrew, Caroll, Zoe, Anders, Anna. So Andrew Blauvelt is the director of Cranbrook Art Museum and curator at large for the Museum of Art and Design in New York. Previously, he was a senior curator of design, research, and publishing at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, where he had held numerous curatorial and administrative positions over his 17-year tenure. He has taught design and architecture at several programs in the United States, Mexico, and the Netherlands. Caroll Harris is a fiber artist who has redefined and subverted the basic concepts of quilting to suit her own purposes, extending the boundaries of traditional quilting by exploring other forms of stitchery, irregular shapes, textures, materials, and objects. She is a 2015 Kresge Fellow for Visual Arts, and Harris's work has been exhibited and published extensively worldwide. Zoe Paul is a mixed media artist working in Athens. She has long been interested in the history of classical sculpture and often addresses this in her work. By parodying works of art from bygone eras, particularly classical Greek sculptures and artifacts, Paul uses geometric abstraction and everyday material to create unexpected relationships which provoke questions of value and taste. Paul explores the character of domestic spaces, both in agricultural and social terms, and is most interested in the intersecting point where interior and exterior perimeters become blurred. Anders World is a sculptor and installation artist whose practice is grounded in ceramics. He lives and works between Detroit and Chicago and received his MFA from the Royal College of Art in London in 2005. Roald has lectured and taught at universities around Europe and North America, including an associate professorship at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago from 2008 to 2017. And he was the head of ceramics here at Cranbrook. Oh, sorry, and from 2008 to 2017, that makes more sense. He was the head of ceramics department at Cranbrook Academy of Art. I was like, you had 2 jobs that whole time? Anna Walker, my amazing co-curator for Olga de Emerald, is the Wingate Foundation Assistant Curator of Decorative Arts, Craft, and Design at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, where she is responsible for the exhibition, research, and publication of the craft collection, the proposal of acquisitions, and development of long-term collection strategy. There you go, Anna. Her most recent projects of MFA-H include the exhibitions In the Studio, Craft and Postwar America from 1950 to 1970, and In Conversation, 18th century Influences on Contemporary Craft. She is currently curating the forthcoming retrospective with me on Olga de Emerald. Hello. Wow, this is a different Laura voice. Okay, thank you so much. I love seeing this packed house, actually, and I love seeing a lot of students in the audience. Thank you guys for coming. We're gonna talk material as material. It's a funny title I came up with, but I think I wanted to begin this discussion about the language of materials. In particular, the contrast between contemporary art and the kind of language that we use in design and craft, which is so material-driven. And, I mean, Andrew, you've been my dialogue partner on this project since I started, and you were the first one to say, like, this is really radical, this idea of, I was like, it is? Like, it's radical, like, for art historians, like, not, like, you know, for normal people. But but I was really interested in your positioning of the project in that way, so maybe we can start there.
Yeah. Well, I think when you originally talked about the idea, I thought, well, material, the way we wanted to look at kind of vernacular histories of material around the world, and how really any material, even something natural, like something extracted from the earth, like coal in the Canellis piece, of course it has its own material history, which is not a newsflash to material culture people, but within, I don't know, I think it's just my life's obligation to try to deconstruct a lot of contemporary art biases. And I think it's an ongoing project of mine, but one of those biases is the emphasis on idea, which has been so prevalent since at least the 1960s. Before that, it was content of work. And I say that as someone who was drawn to art as a child. Actually, I was only interested in conceptual art, which is really funny to be a kid interested in just conceptual art. But then having studied at Cranbrook, where the focus was so much on material and objecthood, but never at the expense of ideas. And I think these dichotomies are what I was interested in trying to advance. And so I thought the show was a great opportunity to be able to look at materials as a kind of witness. We use a kind of line in the show, material witness. What do materials, or what are they a witness to? And what kind of stories can be unpacked by that? So I was interested in that notion for the show.
Anna, I'm going to go to you as an authority in this capacity. And I remember we were both in Bogota recently, and that's where she read my essay. And she was like, I loved your essay. Of course I did. It's all about material. Yeah. True. But I think it'd be interesting. Can you kind of expand on this idea of, is material often the starting point, like for craft? I mean, you know this more than I do, but it's something that has come up again and again when I've talked about this project. So can you talk a little bit about materiality, material studies within the field of craft?
Sure. Well, I can only really speak from sort of the training and the perspective I've had, and I actually started as a maker and working in printmaking and ceramics, and so I think when I sort of moved into a curatorial role and working with materials, it just made so much sense that the craft field foregrounded material and the histories of these different traditions. And I think for me, the exciting part has always been where those materials, the artist and their research process, sort of like how Andrew and how you've said, and I've always sort of said that you're secretly a craft curator and a contemporary art curator. Yes.
Behind my back?
But to your face. I think when we were talking through Landlord Colors, even like our first trip to Bogota, and I was just like, well, this is all very much the dialogues that we have in our field. I think sometimes for the craft field, if I can be so frank, is that we can get wrapped up into process and technique at our detriment. And when it's like, what cone did you fire that to? It sort of starts to stop your conversation from propelling forward. And so for our field, the materials and their meanings that they hold, and unpacking how they've changed over time, how those patinas of the silver can show the different years that they've lived through in the hands that have held them, and the stories that can be told through those materials. I think that's where sort of exciting moments have. And also artists who think beyond the traditions of our material traditions in craft. We often have sort of, if we're thinking about American studio craft, which is sort of the framework that I'm largely working within, they're really tied to certain material histories. And I think today with advances in technology and other materials, that really, it breaks beyond, those sort of standard materials.
Caroll, I would like to, first I want to actually share a quote that Taylor had said about this project, which I really loved. She said, "Too often in recent years, material decay and ruin have become metaphors for this city's post-bankruptcy character. In that we have lost a sense of the very factor that enables activation of such materials in the first place, the Detroiters themselves. While this exhibition prioritizes material, I think it also reminds us of the artist's hand and the lived experiences that belong to that hand." And I really love that, actually, in thinking about Caroll Harris's work. Caroll, I'd love for you to talk about a little bit about your practice. I mean, I'd like to talk about your material aesthetic of rust. This is something that Taylor Aldridge and I actually took up. We co-edited an entire section of, I guess it was like a couple years ago, 2 years ago. For Art 21, we took up the material of rust as part of an investigation and part of the research for this exhibition, and we interviewed Caroll for that. And I think it's very interesting because rust, in many ways, it's like you're starting at the end of the story and you're working backwards. That's what the material is doing once we've already arrived at it. It's also a material that's often, and I would say almost exclusively, associated with failure. And what's really amazing about what Caroll does is she intentionally rusts her fabrics. She invites that process. Caroll, I'd love for you to talk about your relationship to rust and also how that mirrors a lived experience of the city and how thinking about your lifespan and your kind of, and how that kind of contributes also to your process.
That's a lot of information. Well, as you said early on, I don't know, a few years ago, maybe about 10, 15 years ago, something like that, there was this constant narrative about ruin porn, and this is what this represented for a lot of people. What was Detroit? But for some reason, I just really didn't buy into that and didn't see it that way. As I looked at, I saw decay and decomposition. But I don't know, I just saw it as something beautiful and kind of, I don't know, I transferred it or translated it to my own practice as a sort of archaeological documentation of what was happening around me. And just looking for different ways to, as a quilter, I was tired of doing the kind of same old usual kind of quilting thing. So, trying to really give more meaning, I guess, to the material and to what I was doing. And part of this whole decomposition was the marks and the rust and, just the marks of time. And so I started just kind of playing around with what happens when rust goes through its natural process of breaking down, and then started to apply it to fabric and combine it with other fabrics. And as I saw, again, this deconstruction of the buildings around me, I started to see the layers, and how when certain layers of paint, what's her name, the Cuban artist who uses the paint chips. I mean, I was kind of seeing and I'm, can't wait to get to Cuba to see, actually some of that. I mean, I see it a lot around here, so it's not so different, but it was very inspirational to me. Those layers talk to me in terms of history and stories. Why was you see a building deconstructing? Why was this room one area pink paint chips, and why was right next to it was graphic wallpaper or something? But so it started me thinking about the history of those buildings and their lives and that sort of thing, as well as the rusting aspect. So that was one way of actually using that material, decomposed material, in my work, and was to pick up the rust. And it's a little bit toxic sometimes. I found I had an experience when I first started using it, I guess, from breathing it in. I think I had hives for about, 3 or 4 months, really serious hives. And so you have to kind of be careful about how you use some of those materials.
I think this idea of the lives of architecture is a great way to, for Anders, for you to chime in about your process with the project you've done downtown. But so the lives of architecture is the lives of cities and this kind of cycles, and then how you use that also as a metaphor for ceramics and this kind of the kind of production that you do, this idea of fire being this transformative method within ceramics. I mean, it'd be great to hear you kind of narrate those two relationships.
Yeah, is this on? Yeah, can't hear myself, it's weird. It definitely has been the sort of inception of that particular project in Detroit, sort of thinking through ceramics. I've done ceramics since I was 14, and so for me it is kind of a language, like a spoken one, in the sense that when I generate ideas, it often starts with a material. I'm very used to, I need the material friction just in order to create anything at all. It doesn't just kind of, appear in my mind in that sort of way. And so my relationship to material is very particular and one that is generative for ideas, basically. And I'm sure that's not unique, as I think most artists are like that to a large extent. But with the project of the building down on Boy Street, in a sense, the architecture and the materials of that architecture became the material to work from, and both as sort of idea generator, as I started kind of getting to know the building, understanding what it was, and what it potentially kind of could be. It was a very long process getting this whole thing going. I spent 2 years just finding a building that seemed to be appropriate for a number of reasons, and both in terms of what neighborhood was it in. Wanted it to be a building in and of itself that was also kind of isolated, so it wasn't me taking over a building that could be used for a dwelling, but really one that was nobody else really wanted, which was really the case with this building. And then slowly just started to getting to know it, and then started sort of, I did the first piece that I did about this whole project was one where I just took 5 floorboards, laminated them together, carved a bowl of wood out of it, and used all the wood trimmings then to fire a ceramic bowl which then in turn kind of blackened the ceramics. It's called a Saga firing technically. And by that, there was sort of the carbon of the wood was kind of enmeshed into this bowl, and it became kind of this key thing, or this key object into then beginning to actually do the whole installation, this kind of whole transformation metaphor. The ceramic piece also broke in the firing, and so I mended it back in together, utilizing kind of an old school Japanese technique. And so I'm putting this out just to say that, within the histories of craft, there are ideas as well to me. And for me, the techniques, the ideas, the materials offer opportunities to engage something as weird and complicated as a building that nobody wants, a building that nobody cares about anymore, even though it's a building where that has been 100 years of lives being led.
I think that's a great leap off to my next question, which I want to have Zoe speak to. I mean, how can material be used to speak to the themes of the social, political, and the cultural with urgency? I mean, there's often, sometimes, like you said, a meditation on materials can be kind of a closed-door conversation that happens, and I'm interested to think about how there's more universal themes that can be extracted, and I think the kind of urgency of the condition that's happening in Greece, one of the things that has been extracted from a couple of artists from Greece in the exhibition is the fact that in part because of their debt to the European Bank, there are these islands off of the mainland Greece that are now have been converted into industrial mining. And so maybe Zoe can kind of sort of talk about your process of gathering industrial waste and how that speaks to a condition, but also how that then is also part of your weaving practice.
Yeah, I mean, actually for the works that I've presented in the show now, there are three weavings from a series of weavings which are on old grills from this island Yali, which is just next door to a volcanic island Nisiros, and this island is half owned by the Swiss building company Lafarge and half owned by, actually I'm not sure of the other, but essentially it's owned by building manufacturers. And I went there to get pumice stone for a particular project, and I found these grills, which I use a lot in my work. I started making weavings on these abandoned refrigerator grills because the refrigerator is something which, I mean, I grew up on a small island like south of the Peloponnese, and at that time when I was a kid, there wasn't really much. There was electricity, but it didn't work that well, and in a way, like, I guess, to be able to have that opportunity maybe to segue ways of living from a contemporary living that we have today, which is highly digitized, let's say, and technological, to a much more traditional way of living, which changed so dramatically. And I think that, you know, in that place, it was visible. But anyway, so I started making these weavings on these old fridge grills, because it happened that before the refrigerator, people, if you killed an animal in a warm country, I mean, my family's also South African, and then we immigrated to Greece for political reasons, and then the UK, and then I've always been between these countries. So it adds another dimension. But in a warm country, like, if you kill an animal, you have to eat the meat immediately or find ways of preserving it. Overnight, the refrigerator meant that people would kill an animal and then they could keep the meat for themselves. And so then finding these abandoned fridge grills, it also ties in like the weaving techniques, which I grew up with. All the old women in my village were weaving, and then that started to die out, and their families didn't want the blankets that they made because they represented this old way of living, which was seen as poverty and like not something that you wanted to be proud of. My mother was collecting them, so I had these wools, and that's how the weaving started. So to get back to the industrial, well, actually the thing is that in Greece, before tourism, industry was the biggest industry, mining. So Santorini, for example, was all mining. Naxos Island was mining for emery, for like polishing. And so that's why the marble industry really took off there, because they have these emery mines, one of the few places in the world where they have emery. And so mining and industry is a really big part of Greece. That has been kind of stopped, and tourism has taken over. So finding these grills, it's in between what Greece is contemporary Greece, which is, let's say, like in a European sense, a tourist place for the European, and interesting how that's, you know, changed I guess the culture, and especially in terms of Athens now that it's undergoing some major changes within the city. Whether these are positive or negative, it's difficult to say. It's just that it's happening with the amount of tourism that is suddenly coming in. But to go back to the weavings, I mean, I think I'm going a little bit off maybe you want to interject and bring me back on track, because there's so much going on.
Well, I think there's something that's also been interesting to me when I think about found material, because there's a strategy for it. Of course, the idea of the ready-made, these are all very strategic with contemporary art history, but the found object sort of after trauma, after something like the rebellion, in a city like Detroit, or in a context like Greece, after, you know, its own collapse, after, or in the midst of a refugee crisis, these materials take on a completely different kind of meaning. It almost has to be, I think, a different editorial process, because, like, you know, a place like Detroit's a raw nerve. You know, to take something from the city and to use it, and what we bring to that understanding. Yeah, I'd like to open that up as a point of departure. Like, what does it mean to be sourcing from a city or working within the city after a trauma?
But I think that we are always doing that as humans. We are always going through it. I mean, I kind of personally, I believe in a sort of timelessness. So it's also why I make these, along with the weavings, which is something very timeless. Weaving has been a process which people have done for thousands of years. And also I do this ceramics, probably similar to yours, where I like raku fire.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not using any technology. It's using what's there and the kind of what you can find. And but also there is this technological, it's the way that we see, I think, with my weavings, like, they're often, because of the grid, you see them as being almost digital images, but that's like our contemporary way of seeing projected onto these objects. Or I make these beaded curtains where I individually roll millions of little tiny ceramic beads, which are then strung together into a kind of hanging mosaic, let's say, and they become pixelized. But actually they're referring a lot to mosaics, which at the time when people were mosaicing in Byzantium, or, you know, pre-Byzantium, that wasn't even a question. So I think these ways that we like reuse objects, like going back to this island Naxos where they have the emery and the mining, and mining is maybe seen as the more contemporary. Well, in Naxos, the reason that they also have a lot of marble, so there's a big chorus, the Greek statues before the classical. It was the period where, just before the Persian Wars, where they have the very stylized figures. And so there's a big chorus statue just lying in the bush there. And the reason that they were able to do it was because they had this emery, which was the material that was used for polishing the marble. And so I think that these things, we're constantly seeing what we've got and then reusing them. And I think we speak we speak as our contemporary always, because that's what we know, but that's what people in cultures do all the time, right? Like, I don't know, it's my point of...
Yeah, I at the same time, I think maybe in a context like Detroit, like I said, is kind of a raw nerve. This idea of authenticity is often at stake. Who has ownership of the city? Who has a right to speak on the city's behalf? These are something that comes up quite a bit. So when we source from the city, it means something. I mean, there was a famous example in recent years when artist Ryan Mendoza took a house from Detroit and put it into, I think in Brussels. It was like in an art fair in Brussels. Yeah. And we were like, you can't have our house. Like, I know you think we have a lot of them, but you can't just take a house from Detroit, like, as and treat it as like this kind of found object and just reposition it as an outsider, and like that was really this kind of idea, like, no, you can't have that. You can't have that house. I know it's you treating it like it's found, but it's not so simple.
It's like,
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, it's like right, there's ownership, land, structure, and then there's abandonment, right? And the abandonment's strategic in most cases. In other words, no one gives up their rights to ownership, but they give up rights for caring for things. And so that's one of the raw nerves, I think, is who cares for the city when it's been abandoned, right? And but there's never a severing of the actual ownership in most cases, I think. And that's the story of capitalism. But to put it bluntly, right? But I think that's also a tension too, like all of these legal entanglements.
And something I was going to sort of respond to too about this sort of with artists who are in places of turmoil and using materials from those places, there also seems to be much more, at least especially in the three artists that we're speaking with today, this dialogue that's happening between you and the material itself, as opposed to, say, working with a traditional weaving practice. You would string your own loom with your own materials and create a design and pattern that out, but instead you're responding to the place, you're responding to the grills, or you're responding to the rust or the architecture of space, and that sort of response and that dialogue from your place, like that those materials are not to be perhaps contrived into something hiding what they once were, but instead left and part of, the sort of artistic practice. They're left not whole, but they're, present seems to be more representative.
Yeah, can I add to that? Because I started out using rust as a means just to stain cloth to tell that story, but I've since it's been a collaboration with the rusted pieces, and they've said no, I'm not done. So now I'm starting to use them, the actual pieces, as a part of the work. They're being stitched onto cloth and into paper. But so who knows where it'll go after that? It's more than one use. No, go ahead.
From my sort of perspective, in the project in Detroit was very much also for me to begin to even understand the city, I think. I mean, there's taking on that building and sort of caring for it and bringing it up back into sort of also a livable building, because there are other aspects to the building outside of just the installation in and of itself, was a way of frankly just understanding what the hell this city is. I'm a foreigner to this country. I'm not from here. I didn't grow up with this sort of American politics and socioeconomic kind of climate as being present. It's something I've had to learn. It's not a lived experience. And so this was a way for me to begin also to try to understand a little bit, at least, from a very personal perspective, what this city has been going through and what has occurred here. And which is a part of why the installation is also like a permanent sort of thing. It's this thing that will just stay there. It does not have an affiliation with any institution. It does not have a commercial kind of aspect to it or anything like that. It is just there, and it's something that you get into from the street and exists there. So it sits in this kind of strange little place in and of itself. And those aspects have been important for my learning about the city, but also as to how it then continues to exist here.
And for my last question, and then we can open up the audience for some questions, perhaps. It's kind of a gear shift into another direction, but I mean, it's kind of taking up what you were talking about, the limitations of material earlier. And even though you accused me of being a craft curator,
like very excited for me.
Actually, when I talk about my interest in Landlord Colors, and I was trying to what are my resources for it beyond my I don't know, this responsibility to Detroit, and there's so much that goes into my thinking. But in terms of with relationship to material and objecthood, in part is because I started as a maker myself. I started as an artist. So I think I have a heightened sensitivity to it. But also, before I came to Cranbrook, I was based out of Sweden, and this was like a moment where we were all talking about speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. So we were talking a lot about there's a different trajectory where we're looking at materials, and actually this idea of decentering the human as a strategy of thinking about our present and the future in particular. So this was another thing. I was writing about these kinds of things, this idea, like what are the relationships materials have to each other that are outside of us, or outside of us? And this is something that, in part, was a way of thinking sometimes ecologically, like this idea of decentering the human, but it also had a blowback. Some of the things that were complicated by this thinking was, what does it mean to actually move away from the human at this moment when things like corporations are claiming to be humans, claiming to be people now for their own benefit, and became this really kind of murky area. So I guess, in part, I want to kind of talk about the limitations of material. I'm going to have Andrew go next because he knows a little bit of this trajectory, but also just thinking not so much having to go down a philosophical path, but just thinking like, what are the limitations of material, and what is this sort of intersection with this our kind of human experiment at this moment?
Yeah, I'm laughing because I'm working on another project for my other job on the status of the object vis-a-vis our contemporary art, contemporary craft, contemporary design, and contemporary technology. Because I think it's one of these things like material that it's been excavated quite a bit in terms of like talking about philosophy. So just beginning to get into that, but it reminded me of like sort of anti-humanist discourse in the 90s and how that was labeled as that, when in fact it was most of the time it was a liberatory discourse, because like what does it mean to be human? Who defines humanism? That was kind of the rhetoric in the 90s when people were deconstructing things, right? And deconstructing humanities, deconstructing the human-centered perspectives on things. But it was never meant to be like anti-people, right? It's pro-people. And the same thing I feel like today too, like when you say, the more common term I guess for me is like post-human. And what does it mean? What does that frame of mind mean? And of course it means something very different today because we live in the Anthropocene, right? So we live in an age in which the human is determining the fate of itself, not necessarily of the entire Earth, because I don't think the Earth cares. It'll respond to what we do, but so that seems to be the contemporary kind of rub today to me, is this idea of what does it mean to be post-human. But I think it's an interesting perspective to say, do objects care what we think, right? I mean, like we care deeply about objects. This is coming from a design thing. This is what designers do. They try to create emotional bonds between people and their objects. That's the goal, and always has been. But what does it mean to stop doing that? And it's exactly at the same moment that artificial intelligence, that which is not human, tries to become the most human, right? So that's the trajectory within, say, AI. And that's the same discourse in a legal framework around corporations and the status of being human within a corporation. So to me, it's kind of a radical gesture to say that we're going to take this from a completely different perspective. And maybe it is from this perspective. I mean, of course, you're projecting onto all of this. What do two rocks have to say to one another? I don't know. But
well,
we're imagining
teaching
that
rocks how to rust was like, this is such an amazing, when I came here, I was like, this is actually what's, Oyami Dabo's installation that helped seed this idea of landlord colors in many ways. But it also is a kind of performance of this idea of these two having a conversation completely outside of us.
And there's, of course, a long history. I was laughing because I came to this because people now think I'm a craft curator too, but I'm not sure if I am or not. I guess it's okay. But looking at a particular time period in the 1960s as the discourse around conceptual art was being formed, the dematerialization of the art object. At the same time, within the studio craft movement, the sort of apex of the studio craft movement, dealing with the status as art. So craft as art, right? The non-functional, the afunctional, all the discourses around robbing functionality from traditional craft objects. So that's part of the impetus of why I'm particularly interested in that, but I think it's framed by this larger, very large problem that we all face with the future.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess I'd love to position that to the artists. I mean, what does it mean to take on these almost sublime situations, like a place like Detroit or something like the economy? How is that? How do you use materials as a mediation for something like that?
There's about 80 examples upstairs.
I'm not sure I can respond to that in the sort of particular, but I think it, at least in my practice, it gets broken down. You might arrive at that eventually, that sort of larger question, or somebody else can arrive with that through your work, but I don't think, for me as an artist, I don't start there. I start in a very different kind of place and trying to kind of build up meaning, basically, and trying to kind of, begin to kind of slot things together. So, for instance, when I was working on the installation, that was a 5-year process where, one room kind of comes into place, another room comes into place, and that begins to then slot other rooms, but also begins to kind of limit the scope. So the scope is always super wide to begin with, at least in my practice, and then eventually, as I start kind of getting closer towards a show, an installation, whatever I'm doing, right, it suddenly begins to like narrow in, and that's where, within that sort of puzzle, it's in the final choices where the meaning is kind of getting fine-tuned, and when it starts kind of aligning itself to whatever kind of discourses, dialogues, ideas that you want to, try to embrace or understand for yourself, which is, a large part of it.
I think, I work very much in the way that people live together as communities, and I think a lot about that. So maybe I don't start with the material. I'll start playing with the material, but it'll be more of a response to how I see a community functioning together, how people interact, because eventually we build our cities for ourselves and our bodies. And in this installation I did these drawings with raw clay on the walls, and there I use the figure not because it's a figure, but because it's our representation of our own body, which is the first understanding that we have of the world around us, and everything that we encounter is made to scale for our body. And if it's not, then we automatically scale those things to fit us. The chair is the size and it fits us perfectly, and the room is the size because it fits us perfectly. So when I'm doing these paintings on the walls, they're always with this raw clay, which I dig up from the mountain or wherever, and then you can play with different clays, and you're using a different earth, but then we in a way using it to understand the architecture or the space that we're inhabiting. And so that's why they're figures. That it wouldn't make sense for me to paint dogs because I'm not a dog, But and in the same way that I think like the weaving girls, they also have this physical anatomy, you know, they're of that scale, like it becomes a relationship, and I think probably with clay as well, because you're working with the material and then it's like speaking back to you, and I think that's really quite similar in like all of our works, and that's why I think that, I don't know, it's kind of interesting that we're talking about craft and craft curated, because I think craft is very conceptual actually, as a way of understanding the world around us. And I once was asked if I could put something in a show, because I just make like, I don't really have any like depth behind my work, I just make crafty stuff. And I thought that was so funny. That's the perception, I think, a lot of the time. But actually it's not, it's speaking into a really deep like understanding of how communities live together, how architecture works, how we live, and it's a form of communication. And also something that, especially what I find so interesting in making these weavings, which like I speak from a Greek perspective because it's what I know, but it was such a strong medium for so many people, and seen as such a, it's also had this reaction of being very anti-feminist, because, you know, women were forced to like make weavings and stay at home, and actually Greece is quite a matriarchal, it's got a different kind of feminism. But at the same time, that was people were able to like really approach me and be like, wow, that's really interesting, my grandmother used to make that, or like, oh, that's so amazing. So people were seeing these works from an other perspective, and so therefore I am communicating, if art is a form of communication, and then it opens up more questions, and yeah, I think it's...
Yeah. No, I am in agreement there. You know, you just, well, as an artist, I think I just do what I do and use whatever I find that's around me to include in the process is my response to, you know, it's a response to whatever's going on in the world, and which I think is kind of even though it starts from a very particular place, it turns out to be universal. You know, everybody's you know, like she said, people come to me all the time and say, "Oh yeah, my grandmother used to do this, blah 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 blah," but she didn't do it like that. You know, so
yeah, but it's
a
nice
different time
when you get that
material.
Response as well, because it means you're also communicating on like
Right.
another level, and
exactly, because I never intend necessarily to communicate certain things that people bring to it, but, you know, they find something within the work that they can relate to.
Yeah, I think for me, even though I was, in many ways, I'm talking about my own path of getting I started with conceptual art, just like very similarly, I was thinking about very philosophically about material, then when I came to Detroit, all of a sudden it wasn't conceptual anymore. You're so physical. The city was so physical. Like everything just all of a sudden demanded something completely different of me. That's why there's a whole part of my essays about rematerialization. So I mean, my position's clear in that. But I'd actually like to open it up to the audience to see if there's any questions before our next panel.
Can I just add quickly on that note that one thing that I found being in Detroit is like, when I came here to install a show, every Uber driver that I rode with, and I told him what I'm doing here, and everyone was so philosophical and conceptualizing a lot. And when you're in big cities, people don't have time to think, like hectic. And here it offers like, obviously, and I talk to them about it, like, and there's more time to think. I think it's the same, less now, but there was a period in Athens, which was when you're in a time of crisis, you're not able to boom, boom, boom. That you have time to think. Don't get me wrong, but in terms of like, I just think that was an important, for me, that was an important part of being in Detroit, was that the people had time and that they were, and care for each other, and they had time to.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I think Athens was an interesting context is because of Documenta, and the city was so self-reflective. Detroit's a very self-reflective place. We're asked to do it all the time. The artists are asked to do it all the time. And questioning
yourself and your being, and what your worth maybe, and your like.
Yeah.
And that that's something I really got from being in Detroit. That people were very curious and questioning, and yeah.
Questions? Yes.
So we talked about craft as this traditional making process, and we talked about it a lot in terms of its history, and it's
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, and you speak to Cranbrook's long legacy and history within these craft traditions. And I would say that while there are ways where it, as a discipline, if we're thinking of it within academia, so we're just talking right now within academia and not within other ways of coming to craft, because I think there's also the whole conversation around like the different layers of people who come to craft through apprenticeships or people who come to craft through other self-taught methods, which are equally important and worth us talking through. But when it comes to academia, there are ways in which craft schools maybe specifically are dropping out, but I also see these materials and processes being taught under the guise of other sort of names, sculpture, new media. I think it's important to maybe not get too quick to say that everything is, disappearing, because it might just be taking on a slightly new form. That being said, it's important for people who are, teaching these courses to be familiar with the practice and the process and the techniques and be able to actually sort of teach these methods to their fullest potential. So that's I know that's a fear when I talk to my artists and colleagues who are maybe teachers. Maybe you can even speak more to it, those of you who have taught. So
yeah, so I've spent a long time teaching craft, I guess, or in what traditionally has been craft departments, and I agree. It's to a large extent a lot of the sort of craft teaching is happening in departments you wouldn't necessarily kind of affiliate with it. So particularly within painting and sculpture, there is so much ceramics and weaving and fiber kind of going on. And if you look at contemporary art, you could argue that like 20% that's going on right now is kind of fiber and ceramics. It's and so there's been this kind of amazing and kind of strange shift, and I think the repercussion of that is perhaps that some of the more sort of skill-based types of teaching are disappearing for good and bad, right? So there's the sort of whole history of crafts and how we do crafts, how in ceramics you would traditionally learn to throw and then possibly hand build and then whatever else, and through that there was this whole methodology that also began to kind of nominate what kind of objects there are. There's always this reciprocity between process, material, person, right? And there's like it goes back and forth all the time, and so as soon as you know how to do something with a material, that will also begin to define what you then end up doing with that material, right? And so it's both a liability and a gain, and so it's just such a complicated question as to what is craft really, and craft is a culture really when you think about it.
Well, actually, I don't know if you know this, but there's actually we're like in a black hole here. We don't realize how much time we're spending, so we've been talking for a long time, and we have to move on to some other discussions. So can we give a round of applause for our amazing panelists? Thank you. Thank you so much. One of the interesting things about Landlord Colors is there's so many different trajectories in which to follow this exhibition. So we're about to do a very interesting gear shift, but also kind of looking at, I think, very closely this idea of the self-reflexivity of a city. I want to invite Julia Tolke up to give a brief overview of her research. And she's going to be talking about the politics and poetics of street art and graffiti in Athens, and that's going to then lead into our next panel discussion, City as Material, with Taylor Aldridge. She's going to be giving an introduction to our panelists, Cezanne Charles, Abell, Gonzalez, Fernandez. Julia's going to join, and then also with Michael Stone Richards.
Hello. My name is Julia. I'm a PhD student. I guess you'll hear an introduction for me in a moment before that panel. So I'll keep the suspense, but for now I just want to start by thanking the organizers behind Landlord Colors for organizing the show and for bringing me here and welcoming me so warmly to Detroit, particularly Laura and Taylor. And for me, this being here is really very meaningful because this exhibition is incredibly important to me in the sense that I'm currently working on a dissertation project that actually tries to stage an encounter between the city of Athens and the city of Detroit. And those are not necessarily cities that are explicitly thought about in relation to one another very often, although they have, as I argue, and I think Landlord Colors makes very visible. There's a lot of resonances going on, but in the sense that Landlord Colors, at least to my knowledge, is the first instance in which those two cities and their current predicament are really put in relation to one another. It's super important for me to be here and to be part of this conversation. But I'm not here to talk about that specifically, but I'm here to talk about a research project that I've been doing in Athens for the past almost 6 years that's titled Aesthetics of Crisis. And I was asked to talk about this research project, which considers street art and graffiti in Athens in the context of crisis through an artwork that's part of the exhibition upstairs, which is Panos Papadopoulos' Temple of Hephaestus 2013 to 2014. Here it is. And although I did not know this artwork until a couple of days ago, and I haven't seen it until this morning, it really couldn't be a more ideal point of entry into my own research for several reasons. First of all, there's a very uncanny kind of temporal resonance. So Panos Papadopoulos is a Greek artist that had been living and working in Vienna for over a decade and then returned to Athens at the height of the crisis going on there in 2013, as I understand, which is also the exact moment that I started going to Athens to start my research on street art and graffiti. So there's this nice little temporal resonance. And in this sense, I think both his work and my research respond to the same overall condition, to the same shared observation, which is the fact that Greece's prolonged state of emergency has been accompanied by an extraordinary proliferation of street art and graffiti. As it reads in the exhibition catalog on this work, quote, as the financial autonomy of the middle and working classes was systematically hollowed out, the streets of Athens became a primary stage upon which frustrated and disenfranchised citizens articulated their grievances. So in the current moment, and I don't know how many of you have been to Athens recently, but in the current moment, the city is really just completely covered in street art and graffiti, particularly in the central urban neighborhoods. The walls are densely painted and written on. It's very hard to find a kind of empty white wall in Athens. And they're saturated with everything from your classical kind of tags and graffiti pieces to political slogans. There's a lot of portraiture of protest and resistance. Greece, of course, has been a site of tremendous resistance, particularly against austerity, the austerity regime that I think will resonate for people in Detroit, of course, and also kind of depictions of everyday life in the context of crisis and austerity. Papadopoulos' painting, like my own research, interrogates this accumulation of performative interventions in public space as a complex and continuously unfolding visual text, a kind of living archive of the current historical moment of crisis from the perspective of the urban everyday. And it's important to note here, I think, that the relationship between these artworks and words on the walls of the city and the social context in which they exist, the crisis, is not mimetic. The walls of Athens are not an authentic or kind of static representation of the city at a time of crisis. They don't offer any stable belonging, no concrete truth, no directed response. Rather, they accumulate traces of countless personal engagements with the city that deeply resonate with the everyday lived experience of crisis. Performative artifacts that hold the potential to actively transform urban spaces and reimagine everyday life by inscribing alternative histories and possibilities into the very surface of the city. Such performative interventions in public space become politically meaningful in that they constitute what social theorist Michael Warner has called acts of poetic world making. So in his landmark essay, Publics on Counterpublics, Michael Warner states that all discourse and performance addressed to a public must characterize the world in which it attempts to circulate, projecting for that world a concrete and livable shape, and attempting to realize that world through address. So there's always already a kind of implicit kind of prompt for social transformation in any kind of address to public space. And there's a lot I could say about the specific research I've done on this theme and the kinds of bodies of works I've considered, but in anticipation of the upcoming panel on city as material, I want to talk in some depth about the relationship between the street art and graffiti in Athens and the very materiality of the city in the context of crisis. So there's, in the field of urban studies, two kind of broader terms have emerged to describe the material condition, the urban material condition of crisis and austerity urbanism, and those terms really speak to a context of spatial deregulation. So insofar as moments of crisis are always marked by a certain retreat or at least weakening of capital and governance in public space or from public space, they create ruptures in the urban fabric that are then often appropriated by activists and artists, but as both austerity urbanism and crisis urbanism caution are of course always at the risk of being folded right back into kind of neoliberal modes of urban revitalization. So in the case of Athens, this plays out in several ways. On the most general level, there's a distinct lack of public funding to municipal funding that's created a situation in which street art and graffiti is only very sporadically removed from the walls of the city, so it's really only kind of good individual citizens that take care of graffiti and street art removal, or maybe, you know, businesses that have things written on storefronts and stuff like that. But on public buildings, it can largely remain visible for very long periods of time, even on very representative pieces of architecture. So this is the Academy of Athens on a road called Panepistimiou, very central in the city, of course. Very historically representative, and this is what it looked like when I arrived in Athens in January 2013. This is the other side of the same building, and that's still what it looked like 6 months later when I left, essentially. So I think this is a very, very unique situation that allows certain things to unfold. This is also, as I think the Papadopoulos painting renders visible very effectively, allowed for complex dialogues to emerge on the walls of the city. So here's just a little example of a kind of, you know, back and forth between some fascists and anti-fascists on the walls of Athens that just keep editing each other out. More specifically, the divestment and decline occasioned by austerity governance has also created very specific spatial formations that have emerged as highly significant sites of creative and political appropriation. I think that there's a lot of resonance there with the city of Detroit. So you have things like boarded up urban ruins that, you know, where like a boarded up window becomes almost a perfect frame for an artwork. You have what I like to call unfinished architectures. There's a lot of these building shells in the city of Athens that are basically, you know, projects that were abandoned because, you know, the crisis hit and the money just kind of went away. And so you have a lot of these empty building shells that are, of course, interesting for people to engage with. You have a lot of vacant shop windows that have become a site for artworks, posters, all sorts of interventions and interrogations, and also things like empty billboards. And this also speaks to the kind of humor of the streets in the case of Athens that I think also, you know, pops up in other similar situations. These kinds of artworks draw attention to both the gradual destruction of urban space. This is a project that was very omnipresent in 2013. It isn't any longer, but it really fascinated me in that it was a student from the Athens School of Fine Arts who basically kind of traced, as with a marker, the edges of decay and destruction all over the city, thus drawing people's attention to these kind of very small forms of deterioration and decay, as well as and other works also speak to the devaluation of the urban landscape. This is an artist that started popping up about 2 or 3 years ago, also a student of the Athens School of Fine Arts, that basically chose €1 as his tag name. So he just tags €1 all over the city, and it's his personal tag, but it of course also kind of, you know, conjures up this idea of like a sellout, right? And of a devaluation of the urban landscape. Like everything is for sale and everything is €1. So as artworks rhizomatically inhabit the material configurations produced by the crisis, these kinds of ruptures, cracks, vacant spaces, and so forth, they gesture towards the crisis city as a radically contingent site of emerging possibilities and political imaginaries. And then finally, as the context of crisis and austerity also profoundly permeates all aspects of everyday life in the city, it of course also shapes the form and content of artworks that can be found on the walls of Athens. And in my research, I've written about different kind of aesthetic clusters that can be found on the walls of Athens. I'm not going to really talk about all of that. I'm just going to, you know, pick one that has to me become very meaningful. So within the broader field of visual encounters with crisis and austerity on the walls of Athens, the body of work that for me has kind of over the last couple of years remained the most meaningful is the body of work in which the human figure is mobilized as a performative device and a site of display for the everyday effects of crisis and austerity. So the walls of Athens are covered in very visceral, very effective depictions of faces and bodies that are dissolving and fragmented, bruised and broken. There's a lot of kind of very visceral depictions, very expressive, that are kind of marked by the perpetual state of social and affective emergency. By directing us towards the body, particularly the body in its injured and precarious state, such artworks depart from representations of the crisis as an abstract and disembodied economic dynamic that is pretty much the characteristic depiction of mainstream political and media discourses, but rather frames the crisis as a deeply corporeal experience. These artworks operate at the very interface between the private and the public, the inner world of the subject and crisis, and the materiality of the city. In this manner, they push against what anthropologist Athena Athanasiou has called the truth regime of crisis and austerity, the demand to contend with the deeply felt vulnerability and precarity of living with crisis within the privacy of the domestic sphere. On this, she writes, quote, "Not only do people have to engage in a daily struggle against economic hardship and humiliation, but they're also called upon to bear all this without any sign of outrage or dissent. By rendering visible and sensible the corporeal and effective impact of crisis and austerity, these artworks claim the walls of the city as a space for collectively processing and addressing the continuous state of exception." So they take them out of the private, domestic kind of sphere of imagination and put them out on display on the walls of the city. In so doing, they provide a symbolic point of departure for reimagining the crisis as a site where collective forms of solidarity and resistance may emerge. And on that sort of quasi-utopian note, I'll close and hand it over to Taylor for the panel.
Hello, how is everyone? Good, good. My name is Taylor Aldridge. I am an independent curator and writer based here in Detroit, co-curator of Material Detroit, and in some ways thought partner of Laura Mott. And just want to thank you and Andrew for allowing me to collaborate with you all. It's been really rewarding. When Laura and I were talking a bit about City Material panel, and this idea of the sociality of cities, I was thinking a lot about Christina Sharp in her book In the Wake, where she talks about the atmosphere and the weathering of anti-Blackness, or the atmosphere and the weathering of the afterlife of slavery in particular. And so I just wanted to think about that and this idea of weathering in cities in particular, and just adapt that to this conversation, and just leave that with you all as we're working through this conversation. Another scholar that we reference in the description of the piece is Edward Glissant, who has written an incredible book about poetics of relation, which is also a point of departure for this conversation as well. And some of the questions that will be top of mind for us in this conversation is, how is culture defined and materialized in these spaces? How do the politics of spatiality inform our movement, proximity, and engagement with one another? Who decides what is significant and what isn't? How do we account for the otherwise at the margins? And in this panel, we engage with a range of creative thinkers, policy adapters, and scholars to discuss the trajectory of formation as it regards the sociology of cities. So with that said, I want to introduce our esteemed panel. Feel free to just come down as I'm talking. You can feel free to take a seat. First, we have Cezanne Charles, who has more than 20 years experience working within the creative industries in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Currently, she is the co-founder and director of Root of Two, a research and practice-driven hybrid design studio that engages in civic future making, using design methods to facilitate people to imagine and shape collective visions of desirable futures that are more just, resilient, inclusive, and adaptive. From 2008 to 2019, Cezanne served as the director of creative industries at Creative Mini, where she led the company's creative industries research with a core focus on Detroit. Next, we have Abell Gonzalez Fernandez. He is a writer and independent curator based in Cuba. His literary background has been used to approach conceptual and political art and the exercise of creative writing about art. In 2019, he received a grant of the Next Generation program of Prince Claus Foundation to make a series about 349 Decree, launched by the Cuban government to make legal censorship in art. Most recently, he is focusing on the investigations of the Cuban and the Latin America modern tradition from an interdisciplinary perspective. Next, we have Michael Stone Richards, who is a professor of critical theory and visual studies at the College for Creative Studies, Detroit. He is most recently the recipient of the Warhol Foundation grant for his book in progress, Care of the City, Ruination, Abandonment, and Hospitality in Contemporary Practice. Michael has published widely in critical theory and art writing, with essays forthcoming on MacArthur Binion, Black labor and the avant-garde, biopolitics, and the problem of attention in cultural conflict. In fall 2019, Michael will be a visiting scholar in the program in critical studies at Cranbrook Academy of Art. And lastly, we have Julia Tulke, who you just heard from, who is a PhD student in the graduate program in Visual and Cultural Studies at the University of Rochester, New York. Her research centers on the politics and poetics of space, with a particular focus on material landscapes of urban crisis as sites of cultural production and political intervention. She maintains a long-standing interest in political street art and graffiti as performative repertoires of protest. For her ongoing research project, Aesthetics of Crisis, Julia has documented and examined street art and graffiti in Athens, Greece since 2013. So let's give them a round of applause while I walk over. Hello, hello. Can you all hear me? Great. Thank you all for joining me today. I'll just get right into it. I want to open with a quote from Michael Stone Richards from 2016 from his issue of Detroit Research on Dance, where you declare that the publication's aim is, quote, not simply to capture or to report or describe the city, describe the current art of the city, but to develop a critical language anchored in Detroit's emerging art practices as a basis of critical theory of social practice. I want to think through, thinking about this quotation, thinking about your thoughts, MSR, I want to think through language with you all today, just in general, amongst other things. But I want to begin by asking you, Michael, if you could talk a little bit more about this anchoring of criticality, your engagement with it, your experience with it in this city, and then talk a little bit about, from your perspective, the vernacular of the city and how language attends to it.
Taylor, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Good, thank you. And I'd like to thank Laura and Taylor for the incredible work they've both done, and also for the invitation here. If I know you were going to start with Detroit research, I would have brought some copies to sell. There are still some copies of Volume 2 left. And by the way, we sold some at Cranbrook, and some incredible things happened, particularly with architects from New York contacting us. Criticality, so we started, my wife Hattie Langford and I, with a couple of friends, the dancer Bieber Bell, and some students, alums. We started a journal called Detroit Research, the first volume of which was on spaces, came out in 2014. Volume 2 came out in 2016 on dance, and I think in November, Volume 3, which will be on sound, will come out. And in fact, I think I just seen Bieber up there, just arrived. And we were not interested simply in talking about what was going on in Detroit in art terms. Like this exhibition, we thought it was essential that whatever it is that we were interested in be placed within a national and international context, and that we do so as part of the quest for a new vocabulary for talking about whatever it is that we found to be important in art, beginning with questions of space, the politics of space, spatial practice, whatever term it is that you wanted to use. I was in part motivated by what I now call the care of the city. The Warhol project that you were kind enough to mention is a book called Care of the City, where I have tried to develop a kind of spatial politics, a theory of social practice that says, in certain moments of crisis, we begin to think of the city as something like a body. And when we begin to think of the city as like a body, the body needs care. There are certain moments where you know that when people ask for help, there are certain moments when you can send a check. There are other moments that what is needed is one's presence. And the city, certain moments in the city, be it Detroit, be it Cleveland, Pittsburgh, be it Leipzig in Germany or Liverpool. I'm thinking of that great exhibition, Shrinking Cities, that showed us that the shrinking city is an international phenomenon of global capital, not unique, because that was another thing that motivated my thinking and work, which is that there is not a single problem that Detroit has that is unique to Detroit. The problems that Detroit has stem from the fact that it is part of a system of globalization and global capital, but that care points to the need for presence. And I wanted to unpack what this idea of presence would mean in terms of care, proximity, relationship, and forms of play. So over the years, the journal has helped me because of the brilliant people who have edited, given their work, helped me to think through that, and the work that I've been publishing, which has now reached a certain stage, has zeroed in on what does it mean to talk about a care of the city. The question of the vernacular we can get back to a little bit later, but I've sort of posited that the critical vocabulary that I have come up with is to say, if we're going to find something new that speaks not only to what is happening in Detroit, but also beyond Detroit as part of a system of globalization, then that term, I think, is a care, both an ethics of care and a politics of care.
Thank you for that. I want to pivot. I'm glad that you brought up the body, and Julia, you talk about that as well. You talked about that as well within your presentation. I want to engage Abell in this next question and thinking about Cuba. I saw an interview of you where you were talking about countries and codes that exist within specific countries. And you say countries and their cultural areas are consumed through codes. The most exported code of Cuba is photography. And when I read that, I immediately was thinking about Korea in the context of this exhibition, and thinking about the work that comes out of that moment where there was a lot of military rule, and because of that, there was a lot of non-communication and censorship, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about this idea of the code, this concept of the code within cities, and how certain cultural, political, socioeconomic things may inform the way we code our language and communicate with one another. And then thinking about the body as well, how is that coded language sort of imposed on our physical and our psyche? Can you talk a little bit about that and your experience in Cuba?
I want to say thank you, and also to Laura and to the museum to bring me here, and I really am excited about the symposium and about all the exhibitions. I have to say, I have to apologize because my English, I'm gonna probably it's not gonna be so good like your English, but I'm gonna try to do my best.
I only know one language, so you're doing a lot better than me.
Okay, but that's interview that you was watching before. I was talking about photography in the specific sense related with the image of the Cuban Revolution. Definitely the codes to express the relationship with the city, specifically Havana, this is where I live. It have changed during several decades, but there was a moment with this kind of this kind of moment when Havana was resynced by the commanders that came came with the military behind, and they start to reoccupy the city. At that moment, Havana was built like this kind of capitalism context with this kind of lefty radical people using this old institution to make this old institution a communist or a socialist institution. And at that time, all this kind of the called epic moment of the Cuban photography was designed also to export the the success image of the Cuban Revolution. In the beginning, Fidel to mark a distance with the Soviet tradition, because he was accused for many cultural thinkers at that time to be a communist. He chose pictures as a way of propaganda, as a way of propaganda. He actually he canceled all all projects about the statues or monuments, like physical sculptures, to celebrate the Cuban Revolution. But they, at the same time, they found a lot of journals, a lot of publishing houses to make pictures books to export this kind of image. We have very official photographers that they came from the publicity before revolution, and they start to work with the new image of Fidel Castro. He was in, I don't know, in photography sessions with Life magazine, with many publications from the Occidental Occidental world, and also this kind of picture became so popular. After the 90s, actually, I agree with Michael. When all this kind of Soviet industry came down, and basically Havana became a very poor city because there was no money. There was a very popular metaphor that came out, and it was very popular between intellectuals. It was Havana. It was Havana understood like a sick body, you know. It was like a sick body, and all the landscape was representing this kind of decadence, you know. Like the old Havana was almost in ruins, ruins, Actually, Carlos Garaycoa's piece in the 90s. There is a new wave of photographers, and Carlos Garaycoa was one of the most important. And it was curious how in the Carlos Garaycoa's piece work, for example, always there is a body dancing in a room. It's like and all this synergic between bodies and landscape is represented there, and there is many histories in the Cuban literature about Cuban families that they are living a very history of death or sadness inside these kind of ruins. After 2015, with the new Cuban American relationships. Havana finally was, the people that was living in this kind of sick place, they start to refix, they start to attend this new body that they were trying to save. And basically this new image that to me, the most important photographer that represent this kind of moment is Leandro Fayal, this guy this artist that I was talking in the interview. He have this movie called Hotel Roma, and also many series about the new Cuban face. Basically, we start to receive money from abroad, money from people from Miami that came to Cuba to make investments. Also, many people came to Cuba to see what is happening, what was happening there, and. There was revitalized the old tradition that we have had in Cuba about cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan demands. Like people want to live, the people want to go out, the people want to know what is happening abroad. They want to share, and it's like we have been in a closed country during 15 years, and probably 5 years ago was the moment when Havana explodes in that sense. Actually, Leandro have this series called From the Reform to the Counter-Reform that is in MoMA now. That is a documentation of the mega events that were happening in Cuba during the last 3 years, from the Chanel parade until Fidel Castro, until the death of Fidel Castro, and the piece is called From the Reform to the Counter-Reform, because definitely there was a reform 4 years ago happening in Cuba, culturally talking about, economically talking about, and now this reform is stopped because the Trump administration, and also because the new Cuban administration is so conservative. There was a kind of impulse to gentrificate, to reattend this sick body that we have in Cuba, for sure. But it's so dispersed. And now it's starting to be it's starting to be more cultural. Before it was more economic. It was just about restaurants, new business, market.
And so there seems to be a reclaiming of that propagandic tool in a way through your work, would you say? Like you're reclaiming the photographic device in the work that you're doing. that was traditionally used for propaganda or for like a economic advantage?
Yes. And it's hard to explain that because now all the Cuban industry of photography is in contemporary art. There is no many propaganda now. There is no many publications because basically the government is not interested in these kind of things now, and also the traditional photography institutions like newspapers or magazines, they are in complete decadence in Cuba. And it's interesting how is this new moment is the contemporary art probably is the new propaganda of Cuba. You know, it's like because they are trying to rebuild this very old-fashioned image of the Cuban Cuban Revolution or of the Cuban context.
I want to come back to Julia and come back to this idea of the coded language too, and how language exists within the city of Athens. Can you talk a little bit more about the codes in Athens and how it shows up, and then who is it legible to, how, and also what constituencies does it serve in that space?
Hello? Yeah. Yes, I'm happy to. I mean, a lot of the work that I showed, I guess, in terms of just the question of language is English language, not as much Greek, although there is, and the Papadopoulos piece too contains words in both English, Greek, and German to, I guess, kind of gesture towards the larger discourses Athens and the crisis exist within. But there's really different lineages that you can trace when you look at the contemporary kind of configuration of things you can find on the wall. So there's, for instance, a really long tradition of political slogans in Athens as a means of expression. So this is really something that political movements have done at least since the 40s, right on the walls as part of kind of disseminating underground messages, right? It started, I mean, the earliest traces that I've found actual photographic proof of are from the occupation of Greece by Nazi Germany back in the 40s. So there was an underground, where several underground organizations, and they would communicate with the public through painting or really writing words, writing slogans on the walls of the city. They would disseminate information, but also kind of try to maintain a sense of resistance, right? There's still a presence of resistance on the walls. So this is a very important history to keep in mind when thinking about particularly the kind of political writing, and this also informs a lot of graffiti writers that are present and active in Athens and other places in Greece at this moment. So there's a kind of local lineage that is activated here, and in fact, some slogans that you can see on the walls of Athens now are really kind of adaptations of older political slogans. But then, of course, a large body of it is also really geared kind of towards international media. I mean, a lot of it is very kind of figurative or uses the English language. And there's been a lot of media attention for crisis street art in Athens. And there's a lot of like clickbait articles. There's been like major features on this in like every major publication. And usually the way it's presented is like, this is the authentic voice of the crisis. This is the authentic representation of what goes on. But people, artists, street artists and graffiti writers also use it kind of strategically because they know that media outlets will take photos of it. So they also kind of play with that attention. There's, for instance, an artist in Athens that writes variations on the theme, Athens is the new Berlin, Berlin is the new Athens, Athens is the new Athens, Berlin is the new Berlin. Like, he kind of just plays with that. And he also, I've interviewed him several times, and one time he tells me he's an activist, and the next time he tells me he doesn't care about politics. So I think there's a lot of kind of, playfulness in it all that is very, there's a real, of course, cognizance of the fact that the media has trained its eye on Athens very intensely for several years, and there's always moments where this becomes more intense, but so people are aware of that and they respond to that. Mm-hmm. So that's why I tried to make sure it's in my brief talk that, that it's really important not to think of these things as static representations of anything. They're like performative. They activate space, they put out different, kind of messages and voices. They have different lineages that they speak to and make legible, but yeah.
And there seems to be a lot of strategy and awareness in knowing how to play the game of media and visibility.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the piece that I showed on the billboard that said Greece, Europe without Greece is like a party without drugs. I mean, this came up a day after the announcement of the referendum in 2015 when the former Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras held a referendum about the new round of austerity measures that was to be imposed on Greece. So he made it, a public referendum, and there was a lot of, response to that on the streets. But a lot of artists immediately put up like a piece directly related to that within a day or two of the announcement, and they would. They would get messages from media people that would ask them the exact street address where this is, and they would there's a definite awareness.
So I want to continue to think through Athens, and this is a question for everyone, but I'm going to pivot to Cezanne and Julia specifically. But thinking through the presence of art fairs and large-scale cultural initiatives like biennials and things like that, happening specifically in sites of recovery, or what we think about, cities in sort of quote-unquote revitalization. And for instance, Julia, you offer up a wonderful essay on an indigenous response to Documento 14 taking place in Athens. There was a public graffiti work in particular that you highlight where someone had stenciled, "Dear Documenta, I refuse to exoticize myself to increase your cultural capital." And it was signed, quote unquote, sincerely indigenous. You go on to write in the essay of this continued public refusal by people in Athens that, quote, "Though small in scale and modest in distribution, the work gestures towards the contentious relationship between autonomous modes of cultural production that have been fostered by the ongoing state of crises in Greece and the institutional contemporary art world." I want to ask if all of you, but again specifically Cezanne and Julia, if you could talk a bit about the inevitable contentious relationship that takes place between cities and these usually private institutions that sometimes leverage cities in crisis, but at the same time, the city is often in bed with these private organizations and institutions to leverage them in a way. So can you talk about that a little bit, Cezanne?
So I'll just start by saying that I think that there's an interesting process by which a city decides to biennialize itself. And it's for often the same reasons that it decides to host an Olympics. And it's for the same reasons that it decides that there's got to be some way of both projecting a new image and an imaginary about the city, while at the same time being able to aggregate resources to the city for its recovery. If we're talking about the patient and the body, right, coming out of its sickness. And so I think that if we can talk about what it means to make that declaration at a city level, that it's about trying to project both power and influence and a kind of statement of I'm still here. So I think about the early Liverpool biennial since Liverpool came up, and it was very much a sort of scrappy kind of boots on the ground kind of bottom-up thing when it first did it, but it always did it with a plan towards the third one and the sixth one and the eighth and the 10th one, where it would be a capital of culture, because then it could actually draw down resources that it would need in order to sort of produce the larger statement of recovery for the Liverpudlian sort of powerhouse moment. And so I think we have to be clear that biennials do happen to art movements and artists in cities, but they are often the products of the traditional forms of capital and capitalization that we know and have used when we think about why we sort of produce power in the ways that we do. So I think we start there, and I think what's interesting for me is that I've been thinking about how Detroit has resisted its own biennialization, like in waves, successive waves, from the very first conversation of Detroit as the new Berlin that I participated in almost 11 years ago. And I wonder if maybe that will continue and what it might say about the moment that we're at right now in Detroit's art and power and recovery, so to speak.